the fall of Mexico-Tenochtitlan. Friday, August 13, 2021 marks 500 years since the fall of the so-called Aztec Empire. And I wanted to talk about this because, in the 90s, when I started learning my history, that's all I knew. All I knew was Mexica Aztec. Um, all the books were about the Mexica Aztec. Like, that was the driving group of people that were being studied, right? And so a lot of the rethinking of how the Mexica were defeated actually did not come to mind, honestly, to the last 10 years, right? So in my re-education on the Mexica civilization, I'm like, wow, there's so much more to this history that we are presented in any perspective, any traditional perspective. So I just did a video right now for TikTok about what really took down the so-called Aztec Empire. And I say so-called because Aztec was a term given to the Mexica by, I think, this historian called Prescott. Anyway, that's not the term that they called themselves. So the actual term was Mexica. The Mexica group that we know as the Aztec was the seventh migrating group into the Valley of Mexico. So a lot of people also don't know that. They're latecomers into the Valley of Mexico. So before the so-called Aztecs, created and founded the city of Mexico-Tenochtitlan in 1325, it was actually already populated by 6 other massive migrations that had settled in the Valley of Mexico. Now, the fall of Mexico-Tenochtitlan, right, this Friday marks 500 years since the fall of Tenochtitlan. But I have been challenged in my last few years of re-education, right, because I've been studying this for 24 years. But honestly, the last 5 years, I've really I've shifted my perspective, okay? Hear me out. So, first and foremost, I've been taught, right? I shouldn't say we. I've been taught in traditional schools of knowledge, of history, that the Spaniards were so smart and that they used the situation for their benefit, and that they saw the Tlaxcalteca and they saw the political divisions, and took advantage of it. Well, first and foremost, if you land in Mexico in 1519 and you don't understand the language and you don't understand the politics, like, how are we giving them so much credit for them to know so much? Even if they have the translators, I don't buy it, right? But anyway, the narrative usually says that they were so smart and that they took advantage of the situation, right? So no, that's not what happened. The Tlaxcalteca, who allied themselves with the Spaniards, actually fought the Spaniards twice. The Tlaxcaltecas put up 2 battles against the Spaniards before joining forces. Now, the Spanish were about 500, right? 500 or so Spaniards. How many people allied themselves to them? About 100,000. About 100,000 allies joined the Spanish. That's the wrong wording. The way we should see it is, how did the indigenous people of Mexico maximize this interaction with the Spanish? How did they use the Spaniards for their political control, right? Notice the shift, right? We are always taught to look at how the Spaniards did things, how the Spaniards navigated, how the Spaniards took over this population. We are not ever given the perspective on the indigenous perspective. What were the Tlaxcaltecas thinking? What were the Cholultecas thinking? What were the people from the Triple Alliance thinking when they saw the Spanish, right? This is really, really, really important. Now, disease, yes, disease did play a key role, but not initially, right? Initially, we had to find out that the city of Mexico-Tenochtitlan, that they went through famine because they closed off all the, there were different canals. Yeah, there was 3 ways to get into the city of, there were 3 ways to get into the city of Tenochtitlan. So they destroyed those aqueducts, they destroyed those ways, right? So they cut all water, they cut off food to go into Mexico-Tenochtitlan. Right? That's number one. Of course, disease and famine were rampant because the Spanish and the Allies shut down their access to water and food in coming into Mexico-Tenochtitlan. Okay, so yes, disease did play a key role. However, the Tlaxcaltecas, Cholultecas, and other people that allied themselves with the Spanish, they were in the thousands. You know, I think Matthew Restall and Federico Navarrete, they're all kind of bringing together, doing the math, and basically said for every Spanish or Spaniard that was fighting the Mexica, there were 200 indigenous allies. So do the math, right? For every one Spaniard, there were 200 indigenous allies, right? It was Tlaxcalteca, it was Cholulteca. And so what defeated the Mexica was different things, right? First and foremost, they cut down their water source, their food source. So they were starved, right? They were starved. They couldn't get access to water, right? They had killed Moctezuma. There's two narratives. One says that the Spanish killed Moctezuma, and others say that the people killed Moctezuma, right? So that hasn't been, they haven't finalized that argument. And two, we have disease, because disease is rampant. Disease is all over, right? And then you have the indigenous allies, right? And so what people failed to see, I failed to see this, was like, no, like who, it wasn't that the Spaniards were so smart and wow, they took advantage of the situation. No, they were a small group of invaders, right? Coming into a territory that already had conflicts happening, right? For centuries. The Mexica established Mexico-Tenochtitlan in 1325. The Spanish invaded in 1519. So it hadn't been not even 200 years that the Mexica had established themselves. So when they established themselves into the Valley of Mexico, they were fighting up against the different groups of people that were already there, right? And so it's interesting because this perspective to me, it was like, wow, like it's taken me a few years because again, in the 90s, when I started my journey, all I knew was Mexica, Aztec, that's it, right? All the other groups of populations are not really given importance because they make it seem like they defeated the Mexica, everything went down, the Spaniards won, and that's how conquest happened. But it wasn't like that, right? And what I love about Federico Navarrete's research is he says, wait a second, that whole perspective that the Mexica were defeated and that they only focus on the Mexica Aztec is done purposely, and it didn't develop and didn't get refined until the 1800s, right? And this is what blew my mind, because I was like, what the heck? Like, I thought that was set in stone 500 years ago. But in the research of Federico Navarrete and other Mexican historians, you are seeing that these narratives of defeat, these narratives of, oh, well, they conquered us, we're all done. No, right? The Spanish and indigenous allies defeated the Mexica Tenochcas, but they did not defeat the rest of the populations that were in the Valley of Mexico, right? And so that's always overlooked, purposely overlooked, right? And that's what Federico Navarrete does, is because he's saying, yeah, it serves the Criollo elite, it serves this new Mexican nation to group all indigenous people into one group and say they were defeated, end of story, right? And it serves a political purpose that represses indigenous resistance and represses indigenous movements to this day, right? And so it's really interesting to me because, again, this is all new to me. And like I'm telling you, when I started learning, all I knew was Mexica Aztec. I was very Mexica-centric up until learning this new information. So I was like, wow, right? So again, the view and that we have that, oh, once Mexico-Tenochtitlan went down, that was it. Mexico was taken over by the Spanish. That is a lie. That is an exaggeration of fraudulent perspective on what took place, because it actually, what happened was many resistance movements, right? There were some peoples in Mexico that were never defeated or conquered by the Spanish. So it's really important that we look at that, right? But in Mexico, the elite, the Criollos elite, they're trying to give this narrative that the Mexica represent all indigenous people, that once they were defeated, all indigenous people were defeated, right? So that is a political perspective that is being given to us. So that way, first of all, it homogenizes all indigenous people in Mexico, makes it seem that, you know what, they took over the Mexica, so that was it. Game over. We took over. Mexica are done. And everyone's done. But it's not that way. It's politicized. And it was so crazy to me to understand that, because I was like, wait a second. In Mexico, up until the 1800s, the majority of people in Mexico were still speaking an indigenous language. Talk about resistance, right? This is 3 centuries after the invasion of Mexico. And I always thought, in my beginning view of history, was the Spanish invaded, they destroyed the Mexica civilization, that was it, right? Everyone spoke Spanish, that's it, the defeat is gone. But it wasn't that way, right? They defeated, yes, the most powerful group in the Valley of Mexico, but that powerful group didn't even have 200 years of being in power. We're not talking about the Mayan, who had thousands of years of like their zenith of their civilization. We're talking about one group that was the dominant group of the Valley of Mexico, right? And so there are so many other groups of Mexico that were not defeated, that were not conquered, and that kept resisting. So the narrative that we get in the 1800s comes at a time where they're really trying to flatten, they're trying to destroy all indigenous resistance, right? All indigenous resistance. And so to create a narrative that says, oh, todos los indios ya están conquistados, everyone's defeated, we're all mestizos now, it's a new country, it serves a purpose to say that the Mexica, known as so-called Aztec, represent all of Mexico, and they don't, right? Which is why they chose the serpent holding the eagles holding a serpent on the flag. Why did they choose that symbol, right? Because in their narrative, the Mexica had been defeated. They were there, they were done, they were conquered, that's it, right? And it's a narrative that reinforces that's the past. They were defeated, the Mexica were defeated, now we're taking over, now we're a new nation, we're all mestizos now. So the logic, the historical praxis, the logic of white supremacy, of trying to erase all indigenous populations of Mexico, it serves the purpose when you're trying to have a white country, when you're trying to say they were weak, they were outnumbered, they were defeated, now we're Spanish, now we're going to take over, now we're the modern nation, and that's that. But if you notice the populations of Mexico, the languages that were spoken in Mexico, it did not continue up until the 1800s, where the majority of people in Mexico were speaking an indigenous language. That is not a simple fact, right? That tells you that for centuries to this day, our different pueblos, our different communities continue to resist white supremacy and erasure in Mexico. So I wanted to talk about that because this is new knowledge for me. Trust me, within the last 5 years, I've had to challenge my way of thinking, my way of understanding the Spanish conquest of Mexico, and it was hard because I was like, oh shit, like I'm so used to seeing the Mexica a certain way, and then now to understand how complex the history is, how everything came to roll. And yes, initially this is what took place, right? The Tlaxcalteca, they're always included in the Historia de los Vencidos, right? Miguel León Portilla wrote a book called Broken Spears, and he includes the Tlaxcalteca in that book. But he shouldn't include them in that book because they were not defeated, right? The Tlaxcaltecas fought with the Spanish. The Tlaxcaltecas kept their nobility. They kept the power after the invasion and the destruction of Mexico-Tenochtitlan. They drew a códice, right? They created their own codex to demonstrate how they helped the Spanish. This is all, you can look it up, the Lienzo de Tlaxcala. Look up Lienzo de Tlaxcala and you will see what took place. The Tlaxcalteca wanted to make sure that they did not have to give tribute to the Spanish crown. And so they made sure to help the Spanish as best as they could. They even went, I think one of them went to Spain to show and to argue why they should be considered the loyal group. And to this day, I forgot what name they're given, but they're considered the loyal, not loyalists, but basically the loyal group of the Spanish, right? And that to me was interesting because a lot of the times at Tlaxcalteca, they're grouped in with the Mexica to say, oh, los vencidos, right? And broken spears by Miguel León Portilla. And they were not. They were not. They fought hard to not be subjugated by the Spanish. Their nobility, not all of them. This is their nobility, right? Those middle fregones de los Tlaxcaltecas. They created a lienzo de Tlaxcala, and this lienzo is massive. They show everything that they did to help the Spanish, right? And again, at that time, they didn't think of the massive genocide that was taking place. The numbers of the smallpox had not come out. Like, all of this is happening, right? What they cared about was to maintain their autonomy and to maintain control of their possessions. So that's why it was done. So it was interesting to me how we have this narrative that continues to be played out. And I'm telling you, I'm guilty of it because when I started learning my history, Mexica was all I knew. That was the perspective that was given. But now, years later, I'm learning this, right? And I'm like, what the heck? Like, it's not about when Cortez met Moctezuma. It's when Moctezuma met Cortez. What was Moctezuma's intentions? What was he thinking? What were the Tlaxcaltecas thinking? What were the Cholultecas thinking? It's about shifting our view of history of who are the power makers and shift. It's always given to Europeans, right? And so what we have to do is challenge ourselves and say, wait a second, why am I only focusing on the Spanish and this and that? Why am I not centralizing the indigenous person in this altercation, in this conflict, right? I have to centralize the indigenous person and say, what did this person do? What was this person going to benefit from this? And again, we rob our ancestors from that when we just focus on the Spanish. Oh, the Spanish. And this is what we're always told. The Spanish eran chingones, the Spanish did this, the Spanish did that. The Spaniards were a handful of people, you know, who at the end, yes, because of biological warfare, because of all these other things that they were able to defeat a bunch of indigenous populations. But initially, they were used by the Tlaxcaltecas and other people. And no, all of the indigenous populations of Mexico are not defeated, are not conquered. And it's interesting that these historians are arguing that, yeah, that in the 1800s, they were trying to create a narrative of a defeated indigenous past, right? Get over it. We defeated the Mexica. That's it. As if the Mexica represent all of Mexico, and they do not, right? So the fact that they use the eagle and the serpent, and that they're using all these Mexica, you know, symbols, was purposely done because to them, the Mexica were defeated, the Mexica were conquered, end of story, right? And that's how they wanted to proceed moving forward into a modern Mexico, where it's like, oh, no, that's it. We dealt with them. That's it. There's no more resistance. And that's what they did intentionally, right? To destroy indigenous resistance, to destroy all the opposition that took place. And again, remember, in Mexico, up into the 1800s, the majority of Mexico was still speaking an indigenous language in the 1800s when they created Mexico. That tells you a lot about what the culture was like, what the population was like, and who was governing and who was in control of the culture, of the resources at that time. Really important. Okay, gotta go. Just wanted to share my thoughts on that because the Fall of Tenochtitlan, the 500-year anniversary, is coming up this Friday. All right, everybody, have a beautiful night. Just wanted to share that. Have a good night.